So today we're in Fort Worth and the wind is terrible in Texas today. So if there's any audio issues, sorry about that. So 7 months ago, I was shooting with the Blackmagic 6K and I actually sold that camera to buy this camera right here, the Blackmagic 6K Pro. However, the Sony FX3 came out and I couldn't resist but to buy this camera. So since I've had the chance to actually shoot with this guy for 7 months, today I want to go around and just shoot a few different B-roll shots and come back and talk about my entire shooting experience with the Blackmagic 6K Pro. Alright, so just got done shooting and the first thing I can tell you guys is I definitely don't miss having the manual focus. Also, shout out to these guys for helping me with this video today. His Instagram, I'll be leaving the camera guy, he was filming me the whole time. I'll be leaving his Instagram linked below as well. So now, right before I leave, we're about to check out the footage and then we're gonna go back to the studio and talk about the shooting experience. All right guys, so before we get too much further in this video, I wanna go ahead and show you guys the results that I actually shot with the Blackmagic 6K Pro in that short little time that I had while I created that sequence. And then after that, we're gonna come back here and we're gonna talk about my shooting experience compared to what I've been shooting with for the past 7 months. So overall, I really did enjoy picking up this camera and shooting with it. I really love the colors that you're able to get out of the Blackmagic 6K Pro and really all of the Blackmagic cinema cameras. You can get the same effect even with the Blackmagic 4K. So now we're gonna dive into a few differences that I did notice shooting with this camera compared to if I was shooting with the Sony FX3. Now the first one is very obvious and that's being able to use autofocus whenever shooting. There were a lot of times that I didn't really nail the focus right because I haven't had to do manual focus that much in quite a while. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think that this is a disadvantage at all. I'm just saying it was the first thing that I did notice in comparison when shooting with the Sony FX3, which has crazy good autofocus. Now one of the things that I actually had on my mind quite often as I shot with this camera is the fact that I didn't have to get everything perfect when shooting because for the most part I can change most of everything in post with the raw capabilities with the Blackmagic 6K Pro. Now I know that this is a little bit lazy, but it really allowed me to mainly focus on making sure that my focus was good and everything else, again, for the most part, can be changed in post. And to be very specific, you can actually change the white balance in post, you can change the ISO, you can actually do a highlight recovery, a gamut compression, you can even change the color temperature, tint, and exposure. These are all things that usually you can only change on your camera, but with these Blackmagic cinema cameras, you can actually change these settings in post, which actually does give me a bit of security when I'm out shooting and I don't necessarily have the correct white balance, or maybe I don't have the correct exposure. Now the other thing that I did recognize while shooting with this camera compared to my Sony FX3 is the elephant in the room, and that's the battery life. Now within shooting that short sequence, it was actually just enough battery life to get me through the entire shoot, and whenever I got done, it was all the way dead. In comparison, when shooting with my Sony FX3 and shooting something like 4K at 120 frames per second, I'm able to get at least an hour of film time before the battery even gets close to dying. Now I know a lot of people really don't like the ergonomics of this camera, but for me, I really did enjoy holding this bigger camera in my hand and having this huge LCD screen on the back. I don't really know how to describe it, but I really felt a lot more inspired to be creative with my composition in my shots, being able to see everything on the screen exactly how I saw it in my head. And the last thing is having built-in ND filters. I haven't had a camera yet where that's been a feature that's been available to me, and so I really was kind of spoiled whenever I was out shooting having these built-in ND filters outside. So I want to wrap this video up by saying a few different things. Now I do want to make something very clear, because in the past I have compared the Sony FX3 to the Blackmagic 6K Pro, but I think that these two cameras are very different from each other and they really do serve two different use cases. Even though I love the Sony FX3 so much, the real reason why I actually got interested in the Blackmagic cameras again is because a lot of the shoots that I've been doing recently would have been more applicable for a camera like this instead of my Sony FX3. This camera works in studio environments a lot better than my Sony FX3 for many reasons. One of the main ones being that you can actually plug a power cable directly into this camera without having to worry about batteries, which is something you don't get on the Sony FX3. Not to mention, it's just super easy to be able to organize your files within the camera, more so than it is on the Sony FX3. And then obviously being able to have this bigger screen for your director to just look over your shoulder whenever you're composing the shot and get a quick look is a lot more accessible to something like me having to bring an iPad mini for the director to carry around that wirelessly connects to the Sony FX3. I mean, it just kind of gets a little bit more tedious whenever trying to make my Sony FX3 more of a cinema camera. And then the other use case where I really see this useful more than my Sony FX3 is shooting commercial style content. And with that being said, that's also one of the reasons why I was saying that this camera not having autofocus isn't a bad thing, because in both of those examples that I just gave, I would never use autofocus. I would only use manual focus, because in those situations I want full control of where the focus is going to be, and I don't want autofocus jumping around even if I have very expensive autofocus lenses on the camera. And like I said before, it is very comforting to be able to know that a lot of the settings that I'm shooting with on set can be changed in post later if need be. Now I'm not saying that I really rely on that, but knowing that while I'm shooting is very comforting, and it does give me peace whenever I'm shooting with this camera. So here's my final conclusions. If you're a videographer who creates recap videos, social media content, YouTube videos, then something like the Sony FX3 is perfect for you. But if you're someone who's a cinematographer who creates documentaries, you're shooting in studios, you're shooting commercial style content, then I would strongly recommend the Blackmagic 6K for you people. Now don't get me wrong, these cameras can definitely be used in both, and like I said, that's exactly what I've been doing recently. However, like I said, with all the things that come with this camera and with all the things that come with the Sony FX3, I really think that they serve those two types of filmmakers the best. Now if you guys are interested in some more Blackmagic or FX3 content, then I strongly recommend that you check out this playlist or this playlist right over here.